I'm here now with Ali Wolf, who is the chief economist at Zonda, a housing and data and consultancy firm here. And the question that really remains underneath the surface is, what kind of issue are we facing when we look at housing affordability in America? Would you call it a crisis?
I would call it a crisis, and I would say that we have one of the worst housing affordability crises we've ever seen in the nation's history. If you look at home prices, we are at an all-time high today, and the resulting impact is that there's millions of Americans that tell us they want to own a home. They just ultimately can't get to a point that they can afford to be able to buy a home.
So what brought us here, in your view?
Well, it's kind of two big stories and big things that evolved over time. So the first would be the great financial crisis, which really broke the housing market and has had lasting impacts. But we started to get into a more healthy environment going into the pandemic. So 2018, 2019, a little bit more stabilized. And then I would say the pandemic broke the housing market again. We know that a lot of people have locked in low interest rates when they were available, and that's now keeping supply really limited. And there's still people, demographics, millennials, Gen Z, that want to buy homes. So a massive supply and demand imbalance.
How do you describe to people how big this problem has become and what the ripple effects are?
Yeah, so if you look at the estimated housing shortage, it will depend on the firm that you're talking to, but the range is between about 500,000 and 4 million homes shy of what we need. That is based on demographics, and it's based on a lot of underbuilding that we've seen over the past decade. Now, it's really easy for people to say that builders should just build more homes, but there are so many challenges that prevent builders from really picking up any new construction. So while the shortage is here now, it's anticipated to stay because there's not a real easy solution on the horizon.
What role do interest rates play here? Because one massive question in the market is, if so many mortgages are locked in at a rate below 4%, then how far do rates really need to subside in order to reinvigorate this market?
And I want to start by going to your direct question at the beginning, which was how massive do interest rates play in this? If you look at the rent versus own equation, before the pandemic, if someone was going to put 5% down, they had to pay 6% more a month to own a home. And people told us, we're fine paying a little bit more to own a home because we understand the value of home ownership. With higher interest rates and, of course, higher home prices, we're now looking at the rent versus own 60% more expensive to own than to rent. So that really shows you, and the difference is interest rates. So that shows you the power of interest rates. But you were talking about how many people have locked in a low rate. We know that 80% of US households have a rate under 5%. In general, people will say getting back to a 5 handle, even if it's 5.6, 5.8, that will at least help with mobility. Most forecasters, though, don't think we're going to return to that 3 or 4% environment anytime soon.
What is this crowding out? If so many Americans are saddled with higher costs of living and there doesn't seem to be a real end in sight, although please do let me know if there is, what is this preventing in terms of other spending for Americans? What are the ripple effects of this housing affordability crisis?
If you look at US GDP, we know that housing represents between 15 and 18% of the overall market. As people buy homes, you have to think about all of the different touch points. You're going to buy a home, and so first you're going to talk to a loan officer. You'll probably work with a realtor. You'll have escrow that you work with. Once you buy the home, you're going to want to furnish the home. Maybe you're going to want to decorate it. And so there's so much more than just the point of sale with housing transactions. And if you look at new construction, every home that is built creates about 2 to 3 new jobs. So the ripple effect is vast, but we have to remember why the housing market has slowed. So we know part of this is a direct result of what the Federal Reserve wanted to accomplish, because they understand everything I just told you. If the housing market is very strong, that can lead to inflation, that can lead to a lot of growth. And as the housing market has slowed, that's one of the factors that has played into slower economic growth as well.
So When you think about kind of the broader problem, I want to go back a little bit and talk about this affordability crisis. Who does it affect at the end of the day? Is it primarily Gen Z, younger people who are looking into building a family and buying homes for the first time, or is it a much broader set of society?
If you look at home sales and you break them out by category, you could say, all right, what's happening in entry level, what's happening in the middle market, what's happening in the high end market. Surprisingly, the middle market and the high end market are still holding up. There's still a reasonable amount of sales because those purchasers have some form of wealth that is allowing them to still be active, whether that's through the stock market, home equity, retirement savings, just saving over time. So we're not as concerned in general with maybe the baby boomers or the Gen Xers. The group that we're most concerned about with housing affordability will be the millennials that have not already purchased. So these need to be millennials that are renting, and the Gen Z cohort, where the majority of them will be renters today, just given their age.
In some ways, is this really eroding the traditional concept of the American dream? It used to be the case that people would buy a home and build wealth through their homes, the value of their homes appreciating over time. If so many people are locked out of the home ownership market, what does it mean for wealth creation?
It's exactly what you said. We know that wealth is one of the easiest ways, or the most standard way to build wealth, is through home ownership. And so when you look at the older generations that have a high home ownership rate, like the boomers, home ownership rate is about 80%. So you have a lot of people that have been able to at least pay to themselves, invest in themselves, maybe have a nest egg for retirement. If you look at those that have struggled to get onto the home ownership ladder, there is study after study that tells you if you cannot own a home and you do not own a home, there are lasting impacts to your financial well-being. You're not able to build wealth to the same extent. And I talked a lot about the younger generation being impacted by this, but we also know non-white households have a lower home ownership rate, and we also know that has a knock-on effect to their wealth accumulation and generational transfer of wealth over time.
Now, let's bring this to the political sphere. How much is the housing issue becoming really a benchmark of the political landscape here? You're hearing it actually from both sides, but is the problem associated with the Democratic Party or Republican Party more so?
I think if you look at overall housing and you talk to individuals about what matters the most to them, they will tell you that, of course, inflation and the general cost of living, but housing is one of their most key and important issues. I don't think you could directly blame either one of the parties because these are such long-lasting issues. Like I said, starting really in the year 2000, working through the mid-2000s housing boom and the accompanying years after. But now what we know is both political parties are talking about housing to the greatest extent that we've seen since the 1990s. They know that it's important. They know it's something we need to do something about. But I think the big thing that they can't answer, most politicians can't, is how exactly can you solve what's happening today?
So then what do you make, for example, of Kamala Harris's plan to really bring 3 million homes to the market for Americans?
Yeah, so her plan is to add an additional 3 million beyond what builders were already planning to build. And the first thing I would say is it's well intended. It's a nice idea. But for builders, if they could build more homes, generally a lot of them would want to. And if they could, they would do it. We know that there are so many limitations to being able to reach that goal. Well, I know that the candidate Harris is looking at, okay, maybe we can remove some regulation. We heard the same thing from Trump. Maybe we can open up some federal land. We heard the same thing from Trump. But if you think about, okay, that could maybe move the needle, but how does that solve an aging population in the labor force? How does that solve us not having enough developable land? And how does that solve the fact that there's been so much industry consolidation that there's not many builders and developers to be able to backfill supply in the first place?
Well, let's talk through some of these challenges a little more in depth here, because to your point, you did lay out a bunch of hurdles. Is the plan something that's realistic? Can it be achieved to begin with?
I would say there's a very low likelihood that we're going to see 3 million additional homes built. If you think about each of the different categories, it is okay. let's try to solve regulation and let's have the federal government come in and say, hey, we want to try to remove some of the barriers to construction. But if you think about housing and how actual new communities are built, they are built on a local level. It's going to be based on what the local cities deem to be appropriate, what the zoning laws are, what the local land use regulation is, and will the neighbors support new development? So there can be this push to lower some of the regulatory barriers, but ultimately it does become a local story.
What happens on the local level here? Where do you see as the biggest barriers? You pointed some of that out, but talk through logistically what happens when people try to increase supply in a local manner.
Well, the first thing we need to address is land. So if you think about where people want to live and how much developable land is available, the answer is very little land. A lot of the plots of land where people want to live has already been built on. But let's say a builder and developer, they find the land, they're able to get that ready for a builder to go vertical on. The builder is going to have to go to the city. They're going to have to pitch the idea. The city is going to have to approve it, check if it meets their local zoning requirements. The city may give them certain requirements, architectural design, lot sizes, what the home size should be. And then once they get that broad approval, they then have to go out to residents oftentimes. And the residents will say, well, I don't want to build those homes because those homes are either small and they'll bring down my home value, or those homes will increase more people coming into the area, increases congestion. I just don't want it built. So there are so many hurdles at each of those different layers.
It's fascinating because there's been a growing question about this idea of NIMBY or YIMBY, which is yes in my backyard. And you're having very prominent Democrats stand out kind of as the face of this movement, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you look at YIMBY, so yes in my backyard, for so long it's been no in my backyard. And now I think that even some of the different generations where maybe it's a baby boomer that already owns a home and maybe didn't want to see new development or a high density project come in their area, I think they're realizing that one, this will impact economic activity, two, this will impact wealth building, and three, this directly impacts my children. So it has now become not just an issue of, oh, those people can't afford a home. It's actually a lot of people can see this in their own families. And I think that that's encouraging a little bit more of the YIMBY movement.
Was it really former President Obama that brought YIMBY really into the surface here as kind of a bigger part of a party platform? Or was it something else?
I think that it's over time when you look at the lack of housing construction that we've had for the past 15 years. I think there's just been such a long-standing housing affordability issue. I will say I used to talk to builders and developers in 2016, 2017, and we were saying back then that housing affordability was an issue. So that could have started with Obama, but we know that that has been carrying on. It's been a very constant discussion, but it's the pandemic that I think has really turbocharged the discussion of we need to be building more homes, because if we don't, we're impacting a whole generation of Americans.
Well, it's interesting because you see different cities handling this in different ways. You have, for example, New York City and Mayor Eric Adams here trying to put billions of dollars towards affordable housing. Is there a shift here in the way that different cities are handling this and who is on the front lines?
Yeah, and it's tricky because the policy, like I said, will be localized. And you brought up New York. Another area that we could look at is somewhere like Minneapolis. They removed some of their single family zoning laws, and we pulled data recently that captured actually a pretty notable increase in new townhome construction in those areas. So generally, if you see a policy shift, if it has been well thought through and the builders and developers can make the deals make sense, because that's another thing. There could be a policy change, but if the builder says this still isn't financially or economically feasible for me, I'm not going to do anything about it, that's another consideration. So I think in some areas we're finding the policy does allow for an economically feasible deal. In some cases, it's a well-intended policy, it's a good talking point, but it's not actually going to move the needle on housing supply.
How do you think over the last several years, as this affordability crisis has really deepened, how have the politics changed around it?
I think it's what we talked about earlier. I think that there is just a little bit more acceptance and discussion of housing. I'm involved in a meeting every month with the White House to talk about what is happening with housing trends. I think there's this interest to want to know what is going on, what are the key issues, and what can we do to help solve them. So, for example, when we had a big issue with transformers not being able to get power to some communities, I know policymakers were trying to get heavily involved there to say, we know we need to build more homes. We know transformers is one of the issues. So let's try to find a way to support that.
So I want to go back a little bit to the Harris plan to go through some of the details here. You outlined some of the concerns. Let's say she was able to start to get the ball moving. Let's say she was even partially able to get the ball moving if she were elected. What would it mean for home builders, for real estate investors, for private equity firms, for firms that are involved in the building of those homes, anybody who has a stake?
Yeah, so if you look at the overall housing market, we talked about the housing shortage that we see. If we want to say, okay, she's being successful, this policy comes in play, one, we're going to need to make sure that we're increasing the education for labor workers. So we need to make sure that we're able to backfill the labor supply to do so. But I think one of the most important things is there's only, I would say, a select part of the market, in particular from home builders, that will really benefit. If you think back to the mid-2000s, we had 25% of all homes that were sold to public builders. Today, that's up to 50% that's sold to public builders. Besides that, back in 2005, we had 14,000 builders that were building over 10 homes. Now it's 3,000. So there is a certain part of the building community that will be able to benefit from this, but we are talking about a much smaller group than we have seen in the past.
Now, when you think about some of the other policies that have been put forward by the Democratic platform, things like rent caps, how would that complicate the state of housing in America today?
The rental market is so different than what's going on in the for sale market. So if you look at the rental market today, in some markets, in particular in the Sun Belt, there's actually the opposite of what's happening in the for sale market. So right now, we're actually finding that in certain parts of Arizona, of Texas, of Florida, of the Southeast, there's actually a bit too much apartment supply from a developer's point of view, not from an individual's point of view, but that's leading to, in some cases, rents going down and concessions going up. So we're living through a period right now where we have a record number of deliveries of new rental projects coming online, and that is pulling back housing starts. So developers, apartment developers are saying, I don't want to be as aggressive anymore, so I'm not going to build as many new units. If we saw rent caps coming in, that traditionally is another factor that would result in apartment developers saying, you know what, maybe I don't want to. Maybe I don't want to increase supply because now I feel like the government's involved and now I feel like they're not going to allow me to make my deal make sense. So in general, if you look at the apartment community, they will say, obviously, rent control is bad, and that they'll find ways to still pass on costs. I think that's one of the arguments with rent control is you could try to put it in that you can't raise costs, but maybe you can pass on other fees to the renter, or maybe you could stop keeping the property looking as good, which can be damaging to what apartment supply is out there.
Another part of the Democratic platform here, at least Harris's plan, it promises to provide up to $25,000 in down payment support for first-time home buyers. How realistic is that?
This is such an interesting point because there have been different points in time where we've had first-time buyer tax credits. And in general, history tells you that they're successful in at least getting some consumers over the finish line, able to purchase a home. So when you think about today's dynamic, you'll probably read that a lot of people will say, if Harris comes into office and if she passes this $25,000 credit, all that's going to do is juice up the market. It's going to push prices up. This is a bad policy decision. I would say oftentimes I would agree with that. In an environment where you have too little supply and you're trying to increase demand, that becomes a challenge. What's happening in today's market, though, is in the entry level, I wouldn't say that there is too much demand. There's a lot of interest. There are a lot of people that want to buy homes. But like we talked about with affordability, there's a lot of people that can't make it work. And so I think that actually providing a demand side stimulus at the same time as they're thinking about providing the supply side stimulus could be very helpful and very beneficial to the market.
So, as you mentioned earlier, both presidential candidates have brought up the issue of housing. They've just done it in different ways. And we ran through the finer points of the Harris plan. Let's talk about some of the things that former President Trump has been talking about as he has been looking to seek election. And, that includes what you were talking about, this idea of loosening regulations. He spoke to the Economic Club of New York in September, and he spoke to this idea of reducing regulations and opening swaths of federal land for large-scale construction. Can he do that? Easily, at least.
I think what I would say is I'm not sure he can do it. I'm sure there's a way that he can get around it, but you then have to ask yourself, where is that federal land? Where is that relative to an employment center? Where is that relative to where people want to live? So, and how is the land use regulation for that? So you could open up the land, but then you still have to have the city decide what is the best use of this land. So I think it's a very good idea in theory, but once you run through the practical abilities of all of this, I'm not sure it's really going to be the game changer that I think we would hope it to be.
So, in effect, are you saying here that both candidates are going to run into the same problem?
They are going to run into the same problem. It's not an easy solution to be able to increase housing supply. We talked about all of the different factors. I think you need to, I think part of the Trump plan is to also deport some people that are in the US. And if you think about that, I think the argument is we have immigrants that are in here and they're increasing housing demand. But if you look at one of the biggest issues in the housing market, it's what's happening on the labor supply. And we can assume that at least some of those workers have come into the construction industry. So they're also trying to help with that supply side. So I think a lot of them are proposing things. I think the best news is that we do hear from the federal government that there is a focus to try to increase housing supply. I think each little step maybe could move a needle a little bit. Yes, maybe we can have a little bit more of that federal land get opened up, and maybe we can build more homes, not 3 million, but we can do that. I think that's helpful. And I think it's also helpful for local city officials to hear it come from the federal government that, hey, we need to try to think past our local area, think about the wider impact, and everyone trying to move the needle to increase housing supply.
Well, just to dial down on that immigration point for a minute here, what do you make of his point about immigration or immigrants here taking more homes? What is the reality?
If you look at the homeownership rate, and we'll assume that those that are coming into the country are non-white individuals, you're not finding that there's just been this rapid increase or a high level of homeownership rate. It's not a high level. And in fact, if you look at actual statistics of family composition, oftentimes non-white households will have a higher number of individuals per home. So yes, maybe there's more people in the country, but are they necessarily creating households, new household formations? The data doesn't really support that.
When you look into the future, there's a big question that we have here about how much government intervention the housing market is ultimately going to need to start to fix these imbalances. And do you think that in some ways housing is becoming the new healthcare, where there needs to be significant backstops and more discussion around the price of homes in terms of what the government can do to really step in at the end of the day?
I would say on the surface, not yet. I think what we are finding is that one of the core issues, and I would say one of the reasons that the housing supply imbalance looks so bad today, is because the resale market is still locked up. If you look at resale inventory, we're still down 25% compared to pre-pandemic. In 2019, which is the point I'm comparing it to, we were already saying there wasn't enough supply, but we're obviously operating in a much more restricted environment today. Why I don't think it's time for the government to really just go full into this space is that as time goes on, we are finding that the dynamics are changing. We have a 36% increase in resale listings compared to where we were last year. We have some investors that are now selling their homes. We have some people that are sick of putting their lives on hold. I think that over time, as long as builders keep building and as long as there's a little bit of an increase in mobility, I think the market can work itself out. Do we return back to 2019 levels of affordability? Probably not anytime soon, if at all. But we also have to think about how a lot of individuals' economic well-being has also improved since 2019.
Well, to that end, are you saying that the government should stay out of it? Or is there a degree of government intervention that makes sense to you?
To me, some of the things that we talked about, maybe trying to encourage increased regulation makes sense. But the core issue is still that people have locked in this low interest rate and they're unwilling or unable to sell their home because of how the finances have changed in the overall market. I think that there probably is an argument that the government should stay out of it for now. As we see interest rates go down, that should free up some housing supply. That should help make the market feel a little bit more balanced. I think we can reevaluate, but I'm not sure it's time to go to the full extent having the government too involved in this.
Fascinating. Do you think also that there is kind of a reasonable rate here? What is the level that interest rates really need to be to start to unlock that ability to get into new homes, to get new mortgages?
And we don't even really have to guess on this, because if you look at the housing market, the new home market and the existing home market are following two completely different paths. So the existing home market is still frozen because a lot of consumers have to pay market interest rates, and they're not happy with the price of homes, especially when you have the oldest housing stock on record. So a lot of consumers are saying, not that interested in an old existing home if it's expensive and I have a 6% interest rate. On the other hand, what we're finding is that new home builders, the majority of them, are offering incentives to consumers. These incentives will either be funds towards closing costs, flex dollars to update their home, or mortgage rate buydowns. The mortgage rate buydowns is how I feel more comfortable answering your question, because we know that new home sales have actually held up reasonably well, especially compared to the existing home side, because of those incentives, and that a lot of consumers will say, if you can get me a rate at, in some cases, builders are offering 4%. Of course, that really is going to move the needle. But in a lot of cases, someone's saying, if you can get me a rate at 5, 5.5, 5.9 even, there are a lot of people that have gone through with the purchase and in particular have reset a lower rate, because they're saying, I don't want to reset from 3% to 6.5, but if a builder can get me 5.5, I'm willing to reset my interest rate and I'm willing to move. So in general, I'd say a 5 handle is kind of that key interest rate point.
For the mortgage rates, right? So what would that mean in terms of how much the Fed has to cut?
When we look at mortgage rate forecasts, we create our own, and then we also like to look at what other firms are saying just for general consensus. The belief that we see is on average, we'll have interest rates at about 5.8% throughout next year. We are anticipating 2, maybe 3 cuts this year, and then many into next year.
Ali, there are a lot of people out there that believe that when interest rates go down, the price of homes will rise once again significantly because you're all of a sudden introducing all this new demand. How does that work out?
Yeah, but I think you have to ask yourself, are we also going to see an increase in supply? I think that's a very kind of linear thought is, all right, if we lower interest rates, all of a sudden home prices are going to go through the roof. But we know one of the reasons that we've seen home prices rise is because of the lack of supply, because you've had so many existing homeowners that are unwilling to sell their home. But like I mentioned, we're already seeing resale inventory start to loosen. We do anticipate as interest rates go down, you have more existing homeowners that have said, hey, I've gotten married since I bought this house. I got divorced since I bought this house. I had my first, second, third child since I bought this house. I'm now at a point that I'm willing to move. So I think if you see an increase in supply where it's people that are selling their home to buy a home, I think the net effect is fairly neutral. I think one important thing you need to also think about is, what about those sellers that list their home and then don't become another buyer? So that's how you could really see an increase in supply. That could be investors that are saying, I'm ready to offload this property. That's when that idea that, oh, prices are just going to go through the roof gets a little bit fuzzy, because you could have more supply without those investors also turning back into demand.